Hi, in this session we're going to be looking at Midterm Break by Seamus Heaney, and we'll explore the language used in detail to tell, suggest and convey narrative, to study how precise meaning is crafted through literary technique, to notice how Heaney focuses events in recounting the memory, to reflect on the use of adverbials and temporal markers to create a sense of place, to explore how memory of time and place is crafted, to explore the creation of poetic voice and his viewpoint, and to consider how poetic structure creates emotional impact. For Seamus Heaney, his early poems often began with a memory. A Midterm Break explores a time when he left school mid-term. He was at St Columb's College as a boarder. Before we look at the poem, let us explore the emotions, memories and feelings evoked by early school. Look at the pictures on the screen. This is my own primary school from the early 1960s. But what do you remember about being at your own primary school? Do you enjoy visiting or attending a play group? Did you call it preschool? What is the strongest memory you have of early school? Jot down a few things that come to mind. How did you feel about school at the time? Have your feelings changed as you look back? Think about times when you broke up for a holiday. How did you feel about having to leave school? Generally, most people will have mixed feelings about growing up, but over time we can look back with fondness at the early years of our development. In the picture you can see Heaney and two of his siblings, and in the background a vague echo of Mossbourne, their childhood home. Heaney's early life here was a time of playing in the countryside, drinking water collected from the barn's roof, taking his grandfather milk as he dug turf and potatoes in the field. And as he grew, he would have been expected to work and milk the cattle. This all ended when he went to boarding school. In this picture you can see the young children enjoying their early life. Midterm Break by Seamus Heaney. Heaney went to school at St Columb's College, Derry. He began boarding there from 1951. In the poem that we're reading, Midterm Break is about a sudden incident that caused him to leave school in 1953 when he was only 13. In this picture you can see the younger Heaney when he was still at Annahorish Primary School. He would be just about to leave and go to Derry, so the events of the poem are just a few years after this.
Midterm Break. A foot for every year.
So the events of the terrible incident in the poem is a recollection of Heaney's recalling the death of his younger brother. The memories of the siblings at the time and the impact this would have had has been recounted. The sound of baby Daniel, who'll never know his elder sibling Christopher, who has died at the age of 4. And the evocative recalling of the ambulance and the funeral rites and the strangeness of death that impact on the young child's confidence. But most of the significant moment of the poem is the impact of the final terrible lines, the loss, the death, and the sad realization of how small and young Christopher really was. Adverbial phrases can identify when, where, how, and to what degree an event occurs. They act or can act as temporal markers to indicate when something has happened, and they can act deictically to point to where something occurred. If you look at the text, we have quite a few. At 10 o'clock, for the first time in 6 weeks, in the 4-foot box, in the room, next morning, at 2 o'clock, when I came in, on his left temple, now, in the porch, all morning. Look at your poem and underline the adverbials that structure the time and place. What do you notice about how Heaney reconstructs the sequence and the placement of time? If you look back at the adverbials, they suggest a few moments prior to the day of the funeral. But most of the adverbials themselves locate the moment to the vigil itself, the moment when the family and the relatives gather to mourn, to pray, and to sit around the open casket of a loved one. Consider when the poem was written and to what point does the persona, or Heaney's voice in the poem, refer when he says now. From his interviews with Dennis O'Driscoll in Stepping Stones from 2008, Heaney says he wrote Midterm Break in his half-term holiday from Teacher Training College in February 1963, 10 years after the accident when he would have been in his early 20s. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks, paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in a 4-foot box, as in his cot. No gaudy scars. The bumper knocked him clear. Unusually, Heaney uses now to take himself and us as readers back to the time at that moment in 1953. It is the present, the now of the vigil. There is nothing in the poem of an elder Heaney to offer reflection or comment or emotional development, anything that occurs after 1963. So, whilst the verbs recount the action in the past tense, the adverbial now makes that the present, the moment of the poem. If we now look closely at the language, we can see the first person pronouns shape the viewpoint as autobiographical. It is all Heaney's young perspective. I sat, drove me, with the objective pronoun me. I met, my father, with the possessive pronoun my. We've looked at how the narrative sequence is shaped by adverbials all morning in the college. But having sat, Heaney defines the school bell as knelling. This verb is metaphoric and foreshadows the later tragedy, as the bells are knelled, which means to announce a death. The strength of the moments are evoked in the assonance of I for morning in, and the consonants of the hard C in college, sick, counting, which is echoed again in classes close. The first stanza ends with the cadence dropping and the slow pace of the long vowels in drove me home. He knows at this point that something is wrong. It is after all a neighbour who has driven him home, and it is only 2 o'clock. And then stanza 2 begins with a simple declarative. In the porch, I met my father crying. The line later in grey, between the parenthetical dashes, offers the only line approaching a reflective comment from the poet. It's an interjection. He had always taken funerals in his stride. The past perfect he had and the adverb always imply that this is no longer so. And the implicit meaning is that something terrible has happened to destroy his father. The poet's tone is detached, unemotional, and purely objective, as if the child's observation is innocent, unknowing. The next line refers to Big Jim Evans, an endearing epithet to refer to a neighbour, a friend, but the idiom of his father taking it in his stride is matched here and surpassed by the cruel, unthinking pun of it was a hard blow. As we discover, the tragedy is not just an emotional blow, but it is a mortal, crushing blow that kills Christopher. The alliteration of B on Big Jim Evans and hard blow unite him phonetically to his clumsy speech and the long, slow O. Heaney avoids rhymes, but he crafts the structure of the verse in the assonance of close, home, crying, stride, creating a vague echo of part rhyme, disjointed and uneasy. The phonemes of the baby and its noise evoke a naive ignorance of bliss, with the long vowels oo and ah in cooed and laughed. And similarly, Heaney arrives with a long voweled came that shifts to the tense staccato vowels of embarrassed. Heaney's easy manner is affected by the sudden standing up of the men, with its short vowel calling attention to their humble respect, and Heaney's own uneasiness, with enjambment bringing it to the next line of the verse. He is not allowed to forget what is happening. Then Heaney quotes more platitudes in Sorry for My Trouble, but it rings untrue, as the younger Heaney seems not to understand exactly what is happening at all, and is out of sorts. The adults whisper, and these are personified, as if they have greater understanding than the adults who are acting quite strangely. And the enjambment continues as Heaney is further perplexed by his mother, who holds his hand and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. The personification of her sighs as angry, rather than the mother herself, creates further dislocation and greater tension. The stanza ends with a perfunctory adverbial of time, at 2 o'clock, and then a declarative, the ambulance arrived. And there is a list of cold objective terms, the corpse, stanched, and bandaged. This medical terminology and lexis objectifies Christopher as an object, detracted from the sibling that Heaney knew. We get little of the vigil or the wake here as the relatives gather. Heaney is recounting his own memory of the events, from ignorance through the strangeness and then on to the realization and shock of what has happened. Heaney is able to visit Christopher's body next morning. The adverbial moves the narrative forwards. He then simply went up into the room, another declarative. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. These simple statements are given greater force by the personification of soothed, as if no parents can soothe at this moment of their own suffering, as if nothing but these gentle religious items and symbols can offer any solace. And then we have the bold declaratives. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. A whole term has gone by since he's been away, and he's not seen his brother, and now he is dead. The stanza brings us to the dramatic focus of the narrative, as Christopher has changed. The comparative paler shows the death. And this runs on with further enjambment to wearing a poppy bruise. Heaney avoids all mention of death. He shows the visual signs, symbols, and the evocative images of death. The poppy, so redolent of memorials, is used metaphorically to evoke the wound, and the metaphoric wearing suggests Christopher has chosen this, as if with pride, with some cruel irony or disbelief on Heaney's part. The simple declarative, he lay in the 4-foot box, as in a cot, uses the euphemism of the box in place of a coffin, and the simile relates it to a cot, coolly reminding us of the sad innocence of the young child Christopher, but also suggesting he is at peace. The last line of the stanza is again an objective statement. The bumper knocked him clear. At each point Heaney does not comment. The poem is understated, dispassionate, recounting, and yet the implications for the young sibling are shocking and revealed in the final single line. The 4-foot box, a foot for every year. By the end, the cold and brutal death is clear, and the sad loss of an innocent child is cruelly stated in symbol numbers. Those simple numbers remind us that Christopher was barely 4. And with the poem, there are a number of cultural references here to the loss of an innocent one. References to Catholic traditions. It was traditional, for example, for the deceased relative to be brought home and laid out in the open coffin or casket. Relatives and neighbours would visit. There would be a wake, a time of gathering, drinking, praying, to pray for the lost soul and to pray for comfort for the bereaved. The candle would be lit to remind all of God's presence, and the snowdrops, a traditional emblem of death, are used by Heaney here to convey the reality of that death. It is also true that Christopher died in February of 1953, and they may well have been the only flowers on hand, as well as evoking the white purity of innocence and loss, and the mournful weeping of pendulous petals. Christopher was buried in a family grave in the local churchyard. The 8th child of 9, he would be remembered later when Heaney named his second son in his memory.